This is Jason Newton on the Old Connecticut Path here in Ashford, Connecticut. We're on Eastford Road near the junction of Axe Factory Road, directly below the homestead of David and Charles Chism, who recorded their recollection of the stories and their experience as children traveling along the Old Connecticut Path as it traveled through their land and their neighbors' properties here, going down to the East Branch of the Mount Hope River and across to Grass Hill. This morning we're going to follow some old roadways and trails that are within the Natchaug State Forest here in Ashford that give us access to the Old Connecticut Path as it crosses through the valley below. Our pathway follows along old stone walls that were built long after the passage of the parties of Thomas Hooker and John Warham as they traveled along the Old Connecticut Path through this area of Natchaug State Forest. Approach the north branch of Chisholm Brook, we see evidence of an early and ancient box culvert that was set on the pathway here to make travel easier in early times. And stones have been laid clearly in a line, and although the stream has bypassed it over the course of centuries, if we come back around and we can see right here the alignment of the paving stones laid across the brook and the water flowing through and on downstream. Here just above the ancient box culvert on North Chisholm Brook, we find the Beaver Meadow, and right in front of us here the old beaver dam that has been broken over time. A beaver meadow is a place that was a beaver pond, but after there were no beavers, the pond fills in over a period of centuries and becomes a grassy meadowland here in the center of the Natchaug State Forest. Hill from North Chisholm Brook on the Natchaug Trail to the point where it meets the Nipmuck Trail here in Natchaug State Forest. Our walk this morning has brought us to the place on the Natchaug Trail where it meets the Nipmuck Trail in the Natchaug Forest. Based on the map drawn by David Chism of his recollection of the route of the Old Connecticut Path, this portion of the Nipmuck Trail running downhill to Boston Hollow Brook and continuing uphill from here to Eastford Road is where the Old Connecticut Path would have followed. So before heading down to the Brook Crossing and then on to Grass Hill, we'll take a short detour to go up the hill to show where it connects to the upper portion of the Old Connecticut Path. Natchaug Trail, a short distance along a ridgeway that provided firm footing and easy passage. And we've reached the top of the hill where the Nipmuck Trail turns and heads westward. But there is a cart path that continues from here straight on through the woods, on here following the very old cart path to Eastford Road. It is possible for us to get a view looking at a map and looking at David Chism's map to see how this would come together. That Eastford Road is just 100 yards or so beyond through the woods here, and by David Chism's drawing and recollection, the Old Connecticut Path crossed at that point and continued on to their homestead on Axe Factory Road. We'll retrace our steps following the Old Connecticut Path as it crosses downhill to the Boston Hollow Brook. The trail runs on an easy grade and dry land downhill to a small stream where there's some evidence of an early stone culvert with stones laid across the brook that water flows below now, making for an easy crossing point along the Nipmuck Path. As we reach the bottom of the hill, we arrive at Boston Hollow Brook, and down here in the mud along the shoreline I can see footprints of deer, but we can see going right straight across here that the brook, the east branch of the Mount Hope River, or as it's now known, Boston Hollow Brook, at this point would be an easy crossing point on foot. However, for those of us who visit today here in the Natchaug State Forest, our way has been made easier by the provision of a wooden footbridge to help us get across without getting wet. Walk across the bridge over the east branch of the Mount Hope River. And looking downstream at the fording place here, again you can see the crossing would be an easy one at this time of year where the water levels are down. As we continue across the river, and we look upstream, we have a sense of the wilderness here that's open to be experienced for those who come to Natchaug State Forest. And this particular stretch of the Nipmuck Trail coming downhill from the junction and continuing uphill to Eastford Road matches closely with the description and the map laid out by Charles and David Chism. One of the ways in which roads were built to cross wet places in the early days is what they called a corduroy road. And we have an example here on the Nipmuck Path that shows us how, by placing logs across the way, it provides firm footing in an area that at times becomes a wetland or flooded in spring. It's remarkable to be in a place that potentially has been in use for 400 or more years as a footpath here in the Natchaug State Forest. Now, before going over Grass Hill, we're going to take a little detour to the south along the Nipmuck Path to reach Pixie Falls. The water of Boston Hollow Brook flows gently down Pixie Falls here in the Natchaug State Forest in Connecticut, rolling down to a marshland at the bottom of the falls. Pixie Falls along the Boston Hollow Brook is a quiet place just off the Nipmuck Path and would have been likely to have been known to the natives and early travelers along the Connecticut Path. We've reached the point on the Nipmuck Trail where we'll leave the trail, and traces of the Old Connecticut Path, as mapped by Charles and David Chism, curve and follow the contour of Grass Hill over the southern end of the hill to Route 89 and the Old Connecticut Path marker. And we'll take a few minutes to walk in along the old path and see if we can find some traces of the way through here. Here we can see, as we're following along, the twin ruts of the old cart path going through here, and how it's been overgrown over the decades and centuries since it was in use as a pathway through the woods here. Although the way is overgrown, there are places that we find that are open and provide grassy land here in the woods that we can find the old path by following the contour of Grass Hill and walking around on solid ground to gradually ascend the hill. Faint traces of the pathway along the route described by Charles Chism and mapped by David Chism, we arrive at the boundary of the Natchaug State Forest, And we'll follow the boundary over to Grass Hill. We reach a corner of the state forest that adjoins private land and a meadow directly ahead of us that is the southern end of Grass Hill, and would be the point at which, as we see right here, an old cartway leads across the southern end of the hill and over to Route 89 and the Old Connecticut Path marker. Now the meadows here at Grass Hill are still in use as farmland, and even going back to the earliest times of travel, it was recalled that these were grassy hills here in the wilderness and may have been a great place for Thomas Hooker and other parties traveling along the Old Connecticut Path to stop with their cattle and horses for a day's rest. Well, we've come over the hill, over Grass Hill, around to Route 89, where this private drive is the way that the Old Connecticut Path, as described by Charles Chism, would have come down past the old Frank Dolly place. And he ends here at the marker of the trail on Route 89 in Westford. To reach this point, we followed the route laid down and described by Charles Chism and mapped by David Chism back in the 1930s. The route today, for the most part, there are sections that are accessible through the Natchaug State Forest on the Nipmuck and Natchaug trails. However, there are portions that can be found through exploration and search for traces in the woods. The record of the route of travel described by Charles and David Chism gives us a place to start from in our rediscovery of the Old Connecticut Path today. For more information about the Old Connecticut Path as it crosses the Natchaug State Forest and the trails to be found here in the forest and following the Old Connecticut Path, please visit the Old Connecticut Path website.